So I was asked several times on the argument to do with government subsidies, why it has a negative impact. What you'll come across is, more often than not, is an argument as if to say, well, capitalism doesn't work on its own, it needs to be bailed out, it's a failure, etc, etc, it leads to the boom and bust cycle. But like I said, folk, the boom and bust cycle was caused by the trying and testing of the paper currency in the 19th century and the fixing of the interest rates in the 20th century. People don't understand the very fact that capitalism is not a system about guaranteeing success. If you've got incompetent businesses, capitalism, unlike what you've got today, capitalism is about rewarding success and punishing failure. That's not the system you live under. The system you live under is corporatism, where they're rewarding failure and they're punishing success. You can't guarantee 100% success of businesses. Another argument you could add to that, and this is something that they don't understand, you've even got 19th century American history to prove for the failure of government subsidies. The government subsidies was actually a very large part for the incompetence, for the hundreds of private companies all going bankrupt. And this is what they don't understand, because they don't realise that there's incompetence that follows with the subsidies. When Abraham Lincoln stepped in, when you started to see, the internal improvements, which is just really another word for saying that it's, corporate subsidies, it wasn't until that period that you'd begin to see these internal improvements brought in, the likes of the, private turnpike industry, the steamship industry, the railroad industry, and the hundreds of companies in the steamship industry, railroad industry, the turnpike industry, they would all go bankrupt. Proponents of the government subsidies completely ignore us, however. They ignore the fact that the likes of Cornelius Vanderbilt and even the likes of James J. Hill, they were very successful and they refused to take on any government subsidies. They completely refused that. We can actually take a look at this from a quote by James J. Hill himself. Unquote, "The government should not furnish capital to these companies in addition to their enormous land subsidies to enable them to conduct their business in competition with enterprises that have received no aid from the public treasury." Off quote. He was strongly against all of that. He just believed in capitalism, basically, that if you are unsuccessful, you should be just left there to fail, unless of course someone more competent buys over your company and teaches you a lesson, etc, etc. That's the point of failure. Failure is not a negative, and that's the way that these socialists and the quasi-socialists, they look at failure as if it's something of a negative. It's not necessarily the case. Failure is something there to teach you a lesson so that you can improve. You can learn from the mistakes that you make. You're not going to learn from mistakes by simply rewarding failure, by continuing to bail failure out. Would you give a dog a doggy biscuit for every time it's had poor behaviour? Well, you wouldn't do that, so why the hell would you, continue to, bail failure out? In the railroad industry, you saw the North Pacific Railroad Company, and it was around about 1863. This company would build, northern railroads, and instead of going through the Rockies, of course, it would go around the Rockies. What the government did was the government guaranteed a large sum of money for every 1 mile of track that this, company would build. There's no incentive for them to be efficient. After all, they're just guaranteed a sum of money. It doesn't matter how they do the job. It doesn't matter about the materials that are used, time spent. In fact, if anything, they would seek to take longer to do the job. They would seek to take a longer route because it would get them more money out of it, because after all, they're guaranteed a large sum of money for every 1 mile of track. They would seek to take advantage of that. And even if it meant going right through people's neighbourhoods without even a concern, without even caring, about that of the neighbours, which of course they ended up doing, they would just do so. All they're caring about is the fact that they're just guaranteed a large sum of money. By the time they completed the two railroads that they built, damages would come along. This was a company that built the two railroads using poor quality materials. So in other words, they proved their inefficiency. And eventually by 1873, this company would face bankruptcy. Congress was not willing to give them more of a subsidy for the sake of what they were already giving them. The incompetency led them on the road to that bankruptcy. And why was the incompetency there? Because they were subsidised in the first place. After all, you're not going to care about the job that's being done because you're guaranteed the money. When you're faced with a risk in running business, you're under pressure. You're under pressure to make a profit. Be more cautious over what you do. You're also on your toes to make changes if need so. Thomas Sowell even gives the example of companies, technological companies, that had to make changes, and they had to do so because they were making losses. After all, if you remove all of that and just guarantee a business a sum of money, why would they care? They're not making losses, are they? This proved with that of James J. Hill. Like I said, with regards to James J. Hill, he gave the Northern Pacific Company a complete showing up with their Union Pacific Railroad and the Central Pacific Railroads. They were facing the damages. They weren't able to, of course, pay the $50,000. They went bankrupt by 1873, whereas James J. Hill, he managed to build his railroad much quicker, right through the Rockies, so it was a shorter route. He used much better quality materials, and unlike that of the Northern Pacific Company, James J. Hill was benefiting the neighbours surrounding him. James J. Hill is faced with risk. The risk that there's no guarantee of success of his business. How he benefited the neighbours surrounding him is, he says to them, building their farms around his railroads, and he would give them something in return. And that, of course, is part and parcel of the free market. This wasn't the case with that of these, government subsidised companies. They didn't really care about the neighbours, like I say. That's an example of just one company. You could go through hundreds of other railroad companies that took on the government subsidies and are faced with this problem, and it's really no different to that of what you saw of the steamship industry, because it was the same story with Edward Collins. But there's an excellent video and an excellent talk, and of course fulsome, touches upon the robber barons, so I strongly suggest you actually watch this video in particular, and he gives you this story to do with Edward Collins and why Cornelius Vanderbilt had given him a complete showing up. A very good reason for why there is so much incompetency within private businesses even today and even back then was because they're guaranteed such a sum of money. It's not because, they're just private companies. It's because they're subsidised. The reality is, when you have private property, you have the economic reality that you face the reality of your property either appreciating value or depreciating in value. And if you're the one facing the brunt, if you're the one facing the risk of losses, you're the one going to be very concerned. So you're going to look after your property. That isn't the case when it's public ownership, because then that's removed, because someone else will just pay for it. In other words, the taxpayers will just pay for it. It's not my responsibility is kind of the attitude. This was, of course, in relation to what would lead to the 2008 financial crisis and why the legally protected fraud took place. Now, I don't need to go into the argument on the financial crisis because you can check that video out for yourself. The reason for why these bad banks knew that they could get away with doing what they were doing, why they were getting away with such legally protected fraud, why they were getting away with, lending out large, sums of the mortgage loans to these subprime borrowers, why the investment banks were getting away with doing what they were doing. It's because risk is gone. You're not going to be concerned. Again, risk is an important thing, because let's face it, let's imagine you are an investor and you've got the economic reality that you face a risk in every investment that you take. You face the risk that you might not make a return. That's the reality of an investor. You either, make a gain from the investment that you make and make a good return from it, or you face the risk that what you've invested in ends up facing losses. And it's just like, private lenders. They face the risk involved that if they lend out to someone who cannot pay back, they're going to face the risk that they will lose because this borrower may default, in other words, not pay back, and therefore they've just made losses. Because when you remove risk and government steps in and guarantees that these, investors, these creditors, etc., when government steps in and takes away the risk completely, and government says to them, oh, don't worry about any losses, we'll pay for that. And how does government pay for that? How does government pay for their losses, for their incompetence? In other words, how does government reward their failure? Well, it's rather quite simple. The government simply forces the taxpayer of society to collectively pay for their losses. That's the corporatist system. And you've probably heard these terms: capitalising on all the gains and socialising the losses, privatising the gains and socialising the losses, or as some people, this is most often than not misinterpreted, as some people would call it, capitalism for the poor and socialism for the rich. People who don't understand economics misinterpret what that means. It does not mean that capitalism is making you poorer, and it's not meaning that, socialism's making the rich richer. That's how they misinterpret that entire thing. That's not what it means. The only thing that's capitalist about it is the money in terms of paying. However, the coercion to force the taxpayers to pay is not capitalist. Capitalism is about paying through voluntary action, right? Capitalism is not about a government forcing redistribution of wealth to pay for the losses of others. That's socialism, and that's why they call it socializing the losses. It's why they call it socialism for the rich, because what it simply means is these bad banks were getting away with all the fraudulent behaviour, and any gains that they made, they kept. That's what it means by capitalising on all the gains. With all the losses that they make due to incompetence, well, at the end of the day, do they care? No, they don't care, because it's socialising the losses. The government is essentially paying for their losses, guaranteeing that through rewarding their failure that they're being propped up. So even if the entire system collapses, they're gaining from it, they're winning. So even if the investment banks all went under, even if Goldman Sachs went under, or the Lehman Brothers went under, those who were involved in it gain from it, even if their investment bank is no longer there. Government is taking away the risk. That's why government subsidies are so destructive, because the government subsidies is essentially taking away a vitally important thing. It's also a very big reason for the serious debt problem that you've got. This is a system, like I say, that rewards failure and punishes success. So in other words, it doesn't matter how the system is run, doesn't matter how it's operated, how inefficient it is, it's guaranteed its funding. And that's why you will never have efficiency with regards to all of these things that are subsidised. No different to that of the North Pacific Railroad Company, or Edward Collins and his steamship industry, or all the other companies that took on the government subsidies, whether it was the private turnpike industry. Then of course they would face the failure. Now you could draw the difference, and you would see within the private turnpike industry, prior to the 1860s, all of those government subsidies were vetoed. In other words, they couldn't get through the corporate subsidies that they wanted. Of course, this being specific people like Henry Clay, etc., they were the ones in support of it. A number of them, like that of Thomas Jefferson, etc., they were strong opponents to the corporate subsidies, that being the internal improvements. You could draw the comparison between the private turnpike industry between 1794 to 1845, and then compare that period of the private turnpike industry to what it would be like under Abraham Lincoln, when they finally managed to push through these internal improvements. The big difference was, in the turnpike industry, roads were built successfully and completed successfully. The roads that were built met the demands of the consumer, and they were built at a profit. It was private turnpike companies that were operating on them, hundreds of them. And of course, they built thousands of miles of road. Now, these were companies that operated on them, kept them in good condition, etc. And of course, the consumers were getting what they wanted. Whereas the big difference was when, of course, the government stepped in with the internal improvements, the government went on the path of its own. It started its own projects. Roads were left unfinished, built right through people's private farmland without even their consent. So in other words, just typical governments showing their own self-interest. They don't really care about the people. And of course, it led to eventual bankruptcy, and so much so one of the strongest proponents of the internal improvements, Ohio, was actually the first state to legislate against it in its own constitution. And of course, other states would eventually follow. Period between 1794 to 1845 literally gave the period under Abraham Lincoln a complete showing up, and proved for why there's a strong difference between a private sector left be to regulate itself in the absence of that of all these corporate subsidies to that of a private sector that's strongly subsidised. And how they were financing all of these internal improvements in that time period was basically through the strong protectionist tariffs. This is the very reason why you would see the high demand for these strong protectionist tariffs. It just shows that in the absence of the protectionist tariffs and the absence of the government subsidies, private companies proved to be more efficient. But again, it goes back to this point, the vitally important point that many of these people don't understand. And that is the very fact that under capitalism, it's not about guaranteeing success of business. It's not about guaranteeing, 100% success, because that's just unrealistic. And it's not a good thing to reward failure. Because, like I say, you're making the taxpayer poorer, and all you're doing is propping failure up and increasing the debt. You could look at, for example, on the lead up to that of the Sherman Antitrust Act. Of course, the real rationale behind that of the Sherman Antitrust Act, like I pointed out before, was of course the McKinley tariff. And what was discovered in that period was the most successful business people were the likes of these giant trusts, the likes of your, Cornelius Vanderbilts, the likes of your Stanfords, the likes of your John Davison Rockefellers. They were very successful, and it just so happened to be they were the ones benefiting the consumer the most. Whereas when you contrast that to the small business people, the small farmers, etc. in that time period, they were the ones charging the consumer more. They were the ones who knew they could not compete. They were the ones who were incompetent and inefficient. So what did they do to try and make up for their inefficiency? What did they try to do to make up for the fact that they were charging and shafting the consumer? That they were the ones doing the consumer over? What did they do to try and beat out their competition? The Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890. That's right, the very antitrust law legislation that was supposedly brought in to break up monopolies. It wasn't. It was brought in for special interest favours. So in other words, the very people who were supporting the government subsidies were the very people seeking to protect that of these, incompetent business people. We can see that from a quote here. A Congressman Mason stated during the US House of Representatives debates on the Sherman Act that trusts have made products cheaper, have reduced prices. In the same statement, however, the Congressman exposed the real rationale of the Sherman Act. But if the price of oil, for instance, were reduced to 1 cent a barrel, it would not right the wrong done to the people of this country by the trusts, which have destroyed legitimate competition and driven honest men from legitimate business enterprises. To translate what that is basically saying, he is basically arguing to protect the failure. He's arguing to prop up the incompetence. He's arguing to prop up the very business people who were charging the consumer more. These corporatists were arguing to basically take down and weigh down and destroy that of the likes of Rockefeller, etc., who were benefiting the consumer, who were more efficient, and they were the ones who were seeking to destroy the competition. Socialists want you to believe that political entrepreneurs are the same thing as market entrepreneurs, as if to say political entrepreneurs are capitalist. They're not. A capitalist is a James J. Hill. A capitalist is a Cornelius Vanderbilt. They're people who refuse to take on government subsidies. They're people who refuse socialism, in other words. They're people who support capitalism, the separation of the economy from government. It doesn't matter what they say about, but in practice, they'll just, whatever they say, it's not going to defend their position. Because to defend a mixed economy is to defend corporatism. To defend the government subsidies is to defend a position of all the failure to begin with. So they can't defend that. They've not got a leg to stand on. And they most certainly can't stand in a position to defend socialism. Its failure has been that abysmal. You would require extreme ignorance to reach a position of thinking socialism holds value to the economy. Economics is not on their side, neither is history. So I hope this has been informative for yourself. If you've got any questions you would like to ask on the subject matter, feel free to comment in the comments section below, and of course I'll be sure to get back to you. Thank you for watching, and I shall talk to you later. Cheers.